I am outside a Western house here in Nagasaki on Hollander Slope. There's a few Western houses here. Now, the people who built them weren't the Dutch. For instance, this house was a Russian consulate at one point. But they were all called Dutch because the Dutch were the only people allowed in Japan for a couple centuries before it reopened in the 19th century. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Dutch in Japan. So I touched a bit on it in my video on the Europeans in Japan and Christianity in Japan, but just to explain it briefly, the Dutch helped crush Christian uprisings in the 1630s, and the Portuguese, Spanish pretty much angered the Japanese. So the Dutch were the only people allowed to trade for a couple centuries, but they could only do so in Nagasaki in a small island called Dejima. So the Dutch would often sell stuff for silver and copper here in Japan, and then use that silver and copper to buy silk and tea in places like China and India. A few people did make a lot of money, but the trade wasn't great enough to keep the company going through its rough period, and they did try and expand into other holdings in Asia. For instance, they tried to take Taiwan and parts of Vietnam at one point. Plus, every year they had to pay a large tribute to the Shogun. Now, the Shogun was very strict on what could be brought as tribute, so the Dutch tended to give new European inventions like microscopes and clocks. And this spurred on the idea of Rangaku, i.e. Dutch learning, when some, but not many Japanese, would learn from the Dutch. Now, I say some because many people saw what the Dutch were saying as going against their Eastern beliefs. For instance, especially in astronomy, the new European ideas of the Earth going around the sun went against the old Eastern ideas of the Earth being static. Generally speaking, everything that happened in Europe was brought over to Japan. So, hot air balloons, early electricity, beer, and the likes, everything was brought to Japan. Only some things gained popularity though. For instance, some Western painting techniques became very popular. In the 18th century, an artist said how great it was you could make a circle look spherical, or just use a few strokes to represent hair accurately. But there's one invention I want to bring up that I think's pretty important, and that's a karakuri puppet. So when the Dutch brought over early mechanization, the Japanese made these karakuri puppets to serve tea, but they were quickly used in religious practices and helped influence the arts and theatre a great deal. Now, these were essentially the first robots in Japan, and the importance they played during this period could help explain why the Japanese are so, let's say, infatuated with robots today. But I think it's important to remember that a lot of the inventions weren't taken up by the Japanese at all. They were seen as trinkets and toys. So I sometimes think it's over-exaggerated the role the Dutch played.